When I was a kid, kid shows were kind of obsessed with showing people falling into quicksand. Like, quicksand was literally everywhere.
Let's see now. This map says turn left at the swamp. I don't see any swamp. Perhaps a sign will help. Danger, quicksand. Swamp!
As a result of this programming, I actually used to think I probably had a high chance of dying, going on a walk in the woods and falling into quicksand. Is it just me? Or does it feel like getting to the truth these days has become more like quicksand, especially since 2016? You think you're taking one step toward clarity, and the next thing you know, you're sinking deeper, pulled down by shifting facts and conflicting stories. Sometimes I feel like I'm just left asking, who can I really trust anymore? Well, today we're going to step into what I'm calling the fog of facts. Facts seem very elusive these days. This is because we live in an age, I think, of information overload. Some of those messages can even contradict each other within days. And it's like I'm trying to walk through a fog that is so thick that I don't even notice that sometimes the ground underneath me is turning to quicksand. Every step toward truth feels a little uncertain. And the more I struggle for solid footing, the deeper I sometimes seem to sink. So today, we're going to talk honestly about why it's gotten so hard to know what's true and why that challenge is actually a spiritual issue that Christians cannot ignore, and how to begin to crawl your way out of it. Welcome to part 2 of my teaching series on conspiracy theories. Let's get into this. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are watching me from around the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's teaching. I am Krista Bontrager. I'm a public theologian and Christian apologist, and this is the channel where I offer teaching about the Bible and theological commentary on social issues. And I do want to remind you that this podcast is sponsored by viewers just like you. So if you are finding this content helpful, if it's helping you to grow in your faith, disciple your kids and those around you, would you please consider financially partnering with me to help keep me in full-time ministry? You could find out more about how to do that and be part of our mid-year Grow the Family campaign, how to get a cool shirt and some other swag and just get involved more in the ministry at centerforbiblicalunity.com/grow-the-family. So today we're going to take a step into what I'm calling the fog of facts. I don't know about you, but I'm finding it increasingly exhausting to try to vet every news source that I interact with. Maybe you find yourself frequently wondering who you can trust as well. Many people I talk to when I'm out on the road say that they feel tempted to either check out completely from what's happening in the world and what's happening in the news, or they're tempted to go down every rabbit hole looking for the quote unquote real truth, just the way that I did, like I talked about in part 1 of this series. And that kind of a feeling is what I call the fog of facts. Things that were labeled disinformation or conspiracy theories in 2020 are now being openly discussed in many mainstream media outlets. It seems like the goalposts are constantly shifting, definitions are changing, and the normal people like you and I are just left feeling kind of disoriented and exhausted. And over the last decade in particular, I think we've been undergoing a cultural shift where objective facts that which corresponds to reality, what we call truth, is mattering less and less. And there's a stronger push toward truth is my personal emotions, my identity, my tribal loyalty. That is my truth. In fact, in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary named that year, the word of the year was post-truth. And we've seen this idea play out so clearly in politics and on social media. And ironically, 2016 is when I really started noticing the shift as well. It was during the first presidential campaign for Donald Trump. And that was the year that I made my first video trying to help Christians make sense of navigating the sea of fake news. So I've been giving this topic a considerable amount of thought for a decade now. And the consequences, I think, one of the consequences of living in a post truth world is that it has led us into also living in a post trust world, especially since 2020. I think that's really amped up the post trust part. Many of the institutions that we used to rely on, such as government agencies, major media outlets, scientific organizations, and even prominent Christian leaders, have damaged their own credibility through inconsistency, bias, failures to acknowledge when they were wrong, and even outright lies. And when trust gets severely eroded, I think it's understandable that the regular people just start looking somewhere else for answers. Now, some people will retreat into their own echo chambers that just interact with people who confirm what they already believe. Sometimes that gets decided for us by our algorithms, and our algorithms only push content to us from a certain point of view. But when that happens, it can create a vacuum where there is some dangerous information that can come fill it. The desire to want to know the truth, to begin to look in alternative sources for answers, can sometimes lead to some very dark places. And I talked a little bit about my own journey with that last time. And sadly, even some respected evangelical voices have contributed to that distrust by using the conspiracy theorist label, quote unquote, in a pejorative way against fellow believers who are simply trying to raise honest questions. For example, during the height of the pandemic, leaders like Ed Stetzer, who is the current dean at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology, and Joe Carter over at the Gospel Coalition, both wrote strongly worded pieces warning against Christians spreading quote unquote conspiracy theories. Now, I'm not really sure why this article by Ed Stetzer was taken down, but thanks to the Wayback Machine, we can still look at it. This was originally published in the Dallas News, and it was available on the dallasnews.com website. It was an opinion or an editorial. And it's a very interesting kind of look back as things of what Ed Stetzer was saying 6 years ago in 2020 as a major Christian voice. At that time, I think he was heading up the Billy Graham Institute over at Wheaton College. But I just want to highlight this one part of it. For those concerned about the rise of conspiracy theories in the church, it is rather distressing that 3/4 of evangelicals agreed that the mainstream media produces fake news, compared to only 54% of non-evangelicals. More than combating this tendency, church attendance at least once a month was one of the factors more likely to correlate to agreeing that the mainstream media produces fake news. 77% of those people, in other words, who attend church at least once a month, fall into the realm of quote unquote believing conspiracy theories. We understand mistrust of the media that often struggles to accurately report on matters of religion, but those numbers are stunning. So, what Ed Stetzer is saying here is my goodness, evangelicals are some of the most prone people on the face of the earth to believe and promote conspiracy theories. Stetzer and people like him wanted to try to push back against what they considered to be wild and harmful ideas. I can understand that. A lot of their concern involved Christians harming their witness by promoting so-called conspiracy theories, and I understand that. But some would say, myself included, that people like Stetzer and Joe Carter painted with too broad of a brush. They lumped in the people that just wanted to ask legitimate questions about lockdowns, what we were being told about the origin of the virus, certain treatments, debates about the safety and efficacy of vaccines at the time, and lumping those, I think, legitimate questions in with more fringe ideas. And by not carefully differentiating on these issues, this approach caused many thoughtful Christians like myself to unhook from people like Stetzer and Joe Carter as being reliable voices in a time of difficulty. I think a lot of people were like myself. We felt dismissed for simply wanting more evidence, more transparency. We were trying to ask some key questions, but we were just told, you must accept the experimental treatments. We'll put it that way. That many of us just considered too untested. We wanted more time. We wanted more evidence. As I said last time, my doctor, my nurse practitioner now tells me that it's probably good that I didn't get that experimental treatment at the time. You know, the thing that you get in your arm. As I've said before, one of my closest friends has a severe life-altering injury as a result of that thing. And this was another piece of my journey that opened me up to investigating so-called alternative facts. What some would say, people like Ed Stetzer, probably Joe Carter, 2020 Joe Carter, would label conspiracy theories. Trust the science has become a matter of who's telling you the science. It's completely bananas. And it's really hard to make your way through it all. How does someone find their way out of this fog of so-called facts and not just blindly fall into the quicksand of believing a bunch of stuff that isn't, in fact, based in reality? Well, one attempt to bring clarity to all this is to turn to experts who rank conspiracy theories. They'll rank which ones are more plausible and less plausible, which ones have departed reality. For example, here's a chart developed by one conspiracy theory expert named Abby Richards. It's her whole project. She has a whole website and talks and everything about how to cope with conspiracy theories. So she came up with this chart. And it's an inverted pyramid. So down here are the conspiracy theories that Miss Richards thinks are more grounded in reality. MK Ultra, Watergate, the Tuskegee experiment, the FBI spied on MLK, Project Mockingbird. These are the things that she says actually happened, where people actually conspired to do nefarious things. Notice how many of these are in our own government, but I digress. Okay. Next level is we have questions. we've crossed the speculation line. UFOs, Area 51. There's a whole conspiracy theory apparently about the Denver airport being some kind of having underground um, tunnels and specimens of examples of aliens. I don't know. It's a whole thing. But you could click on this thing and it'll take you to an article that'll tell you all about it. Epstein didn't kill himself. The JFK assassination. I guess we're not supposed to ask any questions about that. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Charles Manson was a CIA asset. Might be grounded in reality, but we have questions. But now we're going to leave reality. We're going to go to the next level. Some of these are sort of interesting. The Titanic never sank. Mattress firm money laundering scheme. Ted Cruz is the Zodiac killer. Some of these I haven't even never heard of. Tupac is still alive in Serbia. So these are characterized as unequivocally false, but mostly harmless. Then we get up to the top level. Dangerous to yourself and others. COVID is a bioweapon. I don't know, there might be some things to look into there. I might want to ask more questions about that. Chemtrails. Well, what they used to call commonly chemtrails, it does seem like RFKJ is saying now is the head of what is he, the head of human health and human services? He's saying there's probably something to that. Okay. But this is in the dangerous to yourself and others category, according to Ms. Richards. The global warming hoax. You know what's interesting about global warming is that we don't seem very concerned about it anymore. Now we've got all these AI centers spoiling the environment. I don't know what we're doing, but we don't seem very worried about the environment so much anymore. I'm not sure what to think about that. Ivermectin cures COVID. I don't know. There's been several studies, peer-reviewed studies in journals that would seem to say the contrary. Okay, up to the top. We've crossed now the anti-Semitic point of no return. I'm not sure how anti-Semitism relates to some of these, but look at some of these. Some of these are I don't think conspiracies. I think these might be conspirafacts. Cultural Marxism is real. Yeah, I'm pretty sure cultural Marxism is real, actually. That the deep state exists. And notice how it's right next to the flat earth. So if you believe in the deep state, if you believe that there's bad actors working inside of our government to undermine the traditional view of our government or to add corruption, that's on the same level as believing in the flat earth. Okay. Bill Gates is actively working on depopulation. I mean, these are some things that, like, I think there's some legitimate questions that we could ask here. Now, at least in this model of the inverted pyramid, it starts at the bottom where Miss Richards does see like real documented events. So she's conceding that some level of conspiracies are true. And then as she moves upward, she's trying to say things are increasingly speculative or ideas detached from reality, with the top levels labeled as totally dangerous and anti-Semitic. The problem is that I think all this chart really does is reveals the bias of the person who put it together. If you look at this, it's really about squashing any sort of legitimate debate, any sort of way of looking into things. And by grouping some of these ideas together, it's like, well, wait a minute, is this like a guilt by association thing? How do we ask better questions? But to me, this chart really just reveals how completely subjective some of the conversation is around identifying what ideas ought to be considered conspiracy theories and what ought not to be. And I think it's really a great example of how the personal biases of the creator herself are just reflected in the information and how it's categorized. And this is what makes the fog of confusion so real. All right, let's take a look at a second example here of the kinds of tools that many people try to reach for in that fog of living in a post-truth, post-trust world. And that is fact checkers. Maybe the fact checkers will save us. It sounds promising. We're going to be about facts. Perhaps the fact checkers can help us see beyond our emotions and our personal biases, and they can help us get to objective truth. Fact checkers promise clarity, and they position themselves as kind of neutral arbiters of what's real, what reality is. They will be the adults in the room who will point us to the truth and sort out fact from fiction. Unfortunately, reality is a little more complicated than just hiring some fact checkers. Instead of helping to rebuild trust, in many cases, the cumulative effects 4, 5, 6 years into the whole fact checking phenomenon is that they have actually functioned to erode public trust even further. For example, have you ever noticed that even fact checkers have their own personal bias, and they can frame the data through that bias? Sometimes they will focus on scrutinizing certain voices and claims, but more aggressively go after other voices who promote a different position. Organizations like PolitiFact or Snopes have repeated they repeat certain criticisms for one particular side or the other. And even when they get some of the facts right, the overall they're so biased, and it comes out that it has managed to erode public trust. Even Mark Zuckerberg, the man who arguably was at the tip of the spear of the whole fact checking thing, let's hire some independent fact checkers, himself, on a moment of reflection in January of 2025, just days before the second Trump administration, admitted that Meta's third-party fact-checking partners had been too politically biased and destroyed more trust than they created, and that was leading Meta to scale back that program. Here he is.
Says Meta's complex moderation system makes too many mistakes with too much censorship. Watch.
The fact checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US.
And that's not all. Meta also plans to get rid of restrictions on topics like immigration and gender, and to move.
So when a fact checker gets it wrong, then there's like quiet updates and shifts, and pages and websites quietly disappear. And this further deepens the cynicism of regular people. People think, well, if even the experts, the fact checkers, can't be trusted, who can? Here's what it looks like from someone who is actually on the inside of the world of fact checking. Apologist Abdu Murray recently interviewed a former fact checker on his podcast. And here's what she says. I think it's super interesting, and it really backs up the point that I'm making here.
The other thing I saw is that I would be part of these networks. And whereas I was training people who were kind of going out to be like communicators, activists, folks like that, there was this whole sort of fleet of people who were just there monitoring stuff on the internet. And then they would work hand in hand with like the platform, like trust and safety teams, to basically spotlight what kinds of content, especially back during the Biden administration, when they would actually need more strong arm to like pull content down and things like that. And so they were monitoring all this stuff, but their monitoring tools were aimed almost exclusively at conservative voices. Like they were not like, and because in part, like it would be almost impossible to literally have any kind of a tool that is literally there just, being an arbiter of truth, right? That's not a thing that exists. But to the extent that you're monitoring anything, you should be monitoring neutrally of like, okay, this is what is true on this particular topic. And then let's, flag stuff that isn't. they were just completely, their tools were exclusively trained on conservative voices, on outlets, on conservative influencers, et cetera. And so I was like, this is very clearly an ideological effort here. Like, this is very clearly an effort to silence your opponents, because when I started to ask people, well, how do you know what's true is true? Like, I would just ask people these questions and they would just be like, that's really deep. You're so smart to ask that question. And I'm like, okay, but you are involved in like multi-continental efforts to stifle speech. You might want to think about how do you know what's true is true? And you're working with these government officials who have a very huge power incentive. You're working with, in some cases, industries, the medical industry, there's a bunch of different industries that have a very vested interest in their perspective being held up as the truth and everything else being suppressed. And so, like, these are questions you should ask. With the counter disinfo thing, what I started to see is just how they were very clearly stifling certain things. So we would have these meetings across these coalitions that I would participate in. And so they wanted me to be kind of read into what was going on, so that when I would be doing trainings, I could kind of speak specifically to some of the things that they were seeing. But what that ended up doing, sort of accidentally on their part, is exposing me to stuff that was completely hidden from my algorithm.
Oh, wow.
Because I was still in my little echo chamber. I was kind of starting to change it just by virtue of choosing different content. And so it was slowly, evolving. But because my friends and the people I was following were still pretty much the same people that I had been, following for the previous, however long social media existed up to that point, I was still very much in that algorithmic bubble that was showing me, sort of the approved party line for, millennial woman living in a predominantly progressive area who has this much income, blah, blah, blah. Like, I was still sorted into that bubble. And so when they were sharing, like, these are the things that are trending on the, like, the misinformation or the disinformation things that we need to watch, I was starting to see all these stories about, like, oh, wow, really huge downsides to illegal immigration. Oh, there's actually some, the consensus around gender is completely different than what is being represented, in these spaces and things like that. And so that actually started to tip me off to other people to be like, well, actually, maybe let me see what this Charlie Kirk has to say. Or like, let me, it was actually tipping me off to like investigate some of these other people and voices that I would never have considered beforehand. And so,
Wow. So even people inside these efforts started noticing that the tools themselves were not neutral. They were being used ideologically. And so it's understandable and it makes sense that why so many of us feel like we are in a fog, and why um, we noticed at the Center for Biblical Unity how our whole voice was being suppressed back in 21, 22, 23. That our posts were not being pushed out because we didn't represent the fact checking, quote unquote, correct point of view. And this is why we cannot simply outsource our discernment to gatekeepers. I think it also illustrates how the algorithm is programmed to continually reinforce what we already believe. It shows us the content that it thinks we will agree with, or that will make us get in our emotions and go nuclear because we so strongly disagree with it. It'll make us mad or upset based on what the algorithm thinks that we already believe. Now, this doesn't mean that all fact checking is bad. Good, transparent work does exist, but it's not always easy to find, and you have to vet it a little bit and watch their track record over time and see how they do. But I think we also have to bear in mind that these so-called fact checkers can easily become weaponized to shut down legitimate questions, especially when we've seen a track record in the last few years that some questions later prove to be valid. And that when conversation is shut down, it can make the fog a lot more thick. This leads us to the third challenge in detecting the truth. And that is that the goalposts of what is considered reliable is just constantly shifting. And this is one of the most frustrating parts of living in a post-truth, post-trust world. What was reliable information or quote unquote settled science often is now debatable or even wrong months from now, years from now. And what was once dismissed as conspiracy can suddenly enter into wider acceptance as more information comes out, declassified documents from the government. Notice how many of these conspiracies, again, deal with our government. Like I mentioned in part one of this series, things like the lab leak hypothesis, the coordination of big tech with the government to censor certain voices with certain opinions, risky experiments surrounding gain of function research are now able to be more legitimately debated in the public square, whereas they were completely censored in 2020. And then you have your friends on social media telling you that you don't love your aging parents because you wouldn't comply with policies that you might have seen as dangerous or unnecessary. And then adding to the pile, we had major Christian leaders like Ed Stetzer, who were repeatedly telling us to obey the government's mandates, and that was the only acceptable way to love our neighbor. And this is what made someone like John MacArthur take all kinds of ridicule and heat by people in Big Eva for opening up his church, defying the state of California. And as it turns out, his approach was probably not wrong. It was probably more right based on the science as we understand it now. And the censorship was real. Like back in 2020, I sat in a meeting with some high-level people. You would know who they are if I told you their names. High-level evangelical leaders, where we were being briefed about how to talk about the pandemic in public. And I wanted to ask some questions about whether the vaccines were safe. I felt skeptical about them at that time. It wasn't that I was a denier of all vaccines. There were some things I didn't understand. And so I wanted to ask some questions. Now, I should add that in the room were a number of scientists and people who knew about such issues. And my questions were quickly shut down and labeled conspiracy theories. And I was told very clearly by one of the leaders that asking questions about the safety of a vaccine was inappropriate. And that we were told very directly that the only quote unquote biblical course of action would be to take the vaccine. I felt like I had fallen down like some kind of wormhole or something, some alternative universe. And I ended up leaving that group and no longer participating in those conversations. And at the time, I ended up feeling very ostracized and marginalized and silenced and confused. But BioLogos, arguably the third largest sort of creation or science and faith ministry, we'll call it that, which was founded some years ago, about 10 or 15 years ago by what's his name? Francis Collins, who used to head up the NIH during the pandemic and other times. He's heralded by Rick Warren and Ed Stetzer and all these big Eva voices as being like, this is the paragon of an evangelical who's in the public square. His organization, BioLogos, still has a statement on their website today summarizing what they see as the proper response, Christian response to the pandemic. Love your neighbor, get the shot. It doesn't leave a lot to the imagination there. And they go through all of their beliefs and everything, and it has thousands of signers that signed on to this. And I want to scroll down to the part that says, therefore, because of our faith in Jesus Christ, we will wear masks, get vaccinated, and correct misinformation. We will not participate in conspiracy theories. Wow. Now we know that the founder of BioLogos seems to have played, according to unclassified documents, seems to have played a role in the early days of the pandemic of covering up the origin and trying to contain the narrative and control the narrative. And here he is, condemning Christians who are challenging the mainstream narrative about it at the time. And this is what I mean. It's like, it's completely bananas. It's, who do you believe? This biologos, I would say, while I have differences with them on their views of evolution, are looked at as being a trusted and valued voice at that time. And these are, I mean, picking on the pandemic because it's something that easy that we can relate to. We all have lived through what I believe is the community trauma of that. And it shows us that these are not just isolated cases. It wasn't just one thing. There was multiple things happening all at the same time. And in a post-truth, post-trust world, and where information is moving at the speed of digital media, it is hard to get a grip on what the facts really are. And now we're sitting in the difficult consequences of lost trust. And so in the final part of this teaching, I want to highlight two consequences of this mess along with a solution, or what I think could be part of a solution. And I'm going to get to that right after my friend Kevin talks to you about a new program that's beginning in the ministry at just a couple of months, the Ambassadors for Biblical Justice program. Here's Kevin.
Injustice is all around us. It can leave us feeling helpless and in despair. Can one person really make a difference and push back against the darkness? At the Center for Biblical Unity, we're passionate about equipping Christians to tackle today's cultural challenges through a distinctly biblical worldview. That is why we are launching the Ambassadors for Biblical Justice cohort. This 9-month mentoring program will walk you through the vital and practical tools you need to make a real difference in your community. Maybe you're a mother of a special needs child who has a heart to reach out to other special needs children in your local church. Or maybe you're a pastor who wants to more effectively address poverty in your community. Or maybe you're a businessman who wants to connect the dots between your vocation and your worldview. Whoever you are, if you have a heart for justice and want to explore how it aligns with the historic Christian faith, this program is for you. We are now accepting applications for our inaugural 2026 cohort. You will be mentored by seasoned Christian leaders who will help you apply biblical principles to real-world issues of justice, poverty, and cultural renewal. For more information, please visit centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. Come be a part of our effort to change the world one life at a time.
And I do want to let you know that we are accepting applications right now through the end of July, and the program will begin in mid-August, and we'd love to have you apply. Just go to the website, centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. I think one of the hardest real-world consequences of living in a post-truth, post-trust world is the loss of relationship that comes as a result of this confusion. While it is true that some conspiracy theories are true, it's also true that some have been disproven and some are not substantiated yet. And while some have been debunked, some people still believe in them. It's a complicated picture. But confronting someone who holds to a conspiracy theory can be incredibly difficult and sometimes volatile. And that's because both parties often come into the conversation believing that they are right. And if I believe the best about both parties, it's also quite likely true that both parties want the best for the other person. And what's best for the other person in their mind is to get that person to change their mind and come over to the other way of thinking. The problem is they have two very different systems of interconnected thoughts for what they believe is true. And they want to convince the other person that their position is correct and the other person's position is incorrect. But it's motivated often by the benefit that they have a genuine desire to bring a benefit and a good to the other person's well-being. But your well-meaning attempt to correct another person's misinformation or what you think is misinformation can easily backfire and turn into a very difficult and heated discussion. What started out like a good thing in your heart, if it backfires, can actually end up strengthening the other person's commitment to their beliefs, potentially their misguided beliefs, because their belief is often tied to their sense of being, quote unquote, awake to the truth and letting go of their distrust of an institution or their trust of an institution seems very dangerous to them. And both parties might truly believe that their life would be in danger if they back off of their belief. So then they want to double down, and it's really hard to get somebody to do take the tough road of rethinking a major part of their personal framework of beliefs. This is what makes the discussion so difficult and complicated. And so for the person trying to lovingly challenge the belief of the other person, it can feel like you're hitting a brick wall. You present evidence, you try to present primary sources or counterexamples, and that's dismissed as misinformation or propaganda, or you've been brainwashed. It's all very emotionally draining. And you can start to feel hopeless and frustrated and sometimes even angry. And the real world consequence of living in that post-truth, post-trust culture is that these kinds of discussions about conspiracies can strain relationships. They can even break up marriages. They can break up relationships between parents and children, friendships, church fellowship. And so families stop talking about current events. Friends silently unfollow or distance themselves. And sometimes people feel forced into choosing between loyalty and truth as they see it, and loyalty to loved ones. And again, both sides thinking the best about both sides. They believe they're the ones defending the truth. They're the ones protecting people. And when finding the truth itself has become so confusing, love for each other can get lost in the battle, and relationships can easily fracture. And once trust is broken, it can be really, really hard to rebuild. So my advice to both sides, and we'll talk a little bit more about conversation strategies in another episode, but for now I want to say, like, try to have forbearance with each other, try to have patience with each other on both sides, whether you believe in the thing or you don't believe in the thing. If you're a Christian, we both have to show up better. We both have to show up with patience, forbearance, and love. This brings me to a second, all too common real world consequence of living in a post-truth, post-trust culture. And that is what is called blackpilling. Blackpilling is what social media calls the deep slide into hopelessness and cynicism. Instead of seeing problems and taking personal responsibility and working to solve problems, people fall into a pattern of a mindset that the whole system is irredeemably rigged. Nothing matters. It's kind of a nihilism way of thinking. And trying hard, working hard is just pointless. And it replaces, blackpilling is a mindset that replaces the American dream, or what I prefer to call the biblical call to faithful stewardship. It replaces that optimism with despair. And we see this mindset play out in various demographics, but the one where I'm really noticing a rise in blackpilling is among Gen Z. There's a number of people in the Gen Z generation who are struggling with record levels of anxiety, depression, and a profound loss of hope for the future. But instead of channeling that energy into building careers and getting married and growing a family and doing some positive activities that might actually improve their situation and their community, a growing number are retreating into online echo chambers that just where everybody is just reinforcing the idea that everything is fake and gay and nothing matters and we can't do anything to change the system. And this is one of the tragic fruits of the quicksand. When we've been walking in the fog of facts for a while and then we fall in the quicksand and we don't even know it. When young people grow up in a world where trusted institutions lie on a regular basis and facts shift daily and every narrative feels like manipulation, it's easy to lose the will to strive. Why work hard if you believe the whole game is fixed? Why build anything if you think it's all just going to get taken away from you or collapse anyways? This is the exact opposite of the hopeful, diligent spirit that the scripture calls us to preach the gospel and disciple the nations. The danger of blackpilling is real. A generation that trades hard work and godly ambition for black-pilled despair is a generation that is not only suffering personally, but they are less equipped to be salt and light in a broken world to others. So the challenge of identifying facts in a post-truth, post-trust world is not just some abstract academic issue. It's a spiritual issue. And it impacts real people, normal people, even our children. And I get it. It's exhausting trying to figure this all out. It can make you feel anxious or angry. But my hope is that you can also see it as an opportunity because it's forcing many of us to grow up in our faith, to move past just being a passive consumer of information to active spirit-led discerners of truth. And this brings me to a solution. We can't go back to the old days of simply trusting one or two big institutions to tell us what's true. And to be honest, I'm not even sure I want to go back to that. I'm not sure it's healthy. But if we don't want to get completely lost in the fog and retreat into our own echo chambers and eventually drown in the quicksand of internet rumors, and we've got to do something different. I think a better path is to become active, wise discerners. And we'll talk more about some biblical principles related to this in part 3 of this series. But for now, I want to offer some brief practical help. And that is to try to help you find some trusted news sources that report reality. This is a very common question I'm getting these days. And my husband encouraged me to do this and put this out. So I'm going to do it. So here are some independent alternative news sources that I use regularly and I have found reliable over the years. These sources emphasize primary documents, original reporting, and a willingness to challenge the majority opinion when needed. These are kind of some people who have helped me cut through the noise on a weekly basis. They're not perfect people. No source is perfect. They represent a range of thoughtful investigative journalism that sometimes challenges mainstream narratives with evidence, okay? But you got to do your own thinking. I'm not doing your thinking for you. This is a starting point. Number 1 is Chuck Holton. He's an independent Christian journalist. He often does reporting in other countries about wars, conflict zones, national security. He's a great source for geopolitical news. He live streams every day, but if you don't want to watch the live stream every day, he does condensed versions of his live streams. But he also is a Christian and he brings a biblical worldview to things. And he's sometimes critical of Trump when I think Trump needs to be criticized. And he's also explains when he supports the president's decisions without being overly sensational. Michael Schellenberger, he has a Substack at public.news. He's got excellent long-form investigative work especially on energy policy, homelessness, crime, and government overreach. Very evidence-based. I really like Schellenberger. Now, I've heard rumors that he's become a Christian, but I can't confirm that publicly. But I've heard from a couple of people that have told me that he's become a Christian. That's kind of interesting to me. But he would be a good person for you to follow. If you're on X, you can give him a follow. The Free Press. Now, the Free Press was founded by Barry Weiss. She used to work at the New York Times. She was a senior editor there. The Free Press is strong on cultural issues, free speech, investigative journalism. Now, Barry Weiss, the founder, is Jewish, lesbian, I would call her center-left person, okay? But she reports in reality. She's not, the Free Press is not some big, like, pro rainbow people type of thing. They really try to do the old-fashioned, fair and balanced thing. And she left the New York Times because she was just so sick of the gross partisanship there. Now, more recently, she was hired by CBS to remake CBS, the national CBS affiliate for the news. And she is very not liked by the mainstream media, but she is the founder of the Free Press, and she's been brought on to CBS to try to see if she can bring some sanity to that realm of the news segment. We'll see if she lasts. Andy No. He's a great follow on X. He also posts over at the Post Millennial, which is another great follow. Libby Emmons and her team there at the Post Millennial. And Andy No's reporting on Antifa and political violence and urban crime is amazing. Now, Andy No is a participant in an alternative lifestyle, but he's a guy that I think we should pray for. And he does excellent reporting on these issues. And I have followed him for a number of years and found his reporting very helpful. Again, Post Millennial, they break a number of stories regularly related to culture, education, Gen Z related topics, and that sort of thing. Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi is, I would characterize him as center-left guy, runs a Substack, but he does a lot of really great investigative journalism and was behind all of the disclosures behind the Twitter files and the government overreach and media failures. And he reports on financial corruption, and he can have helpful information. John Solomon, in his work at Just the News, he does investigative reporting. He reports a lot on government accountability, legal issues, document releases, and that kind of thing. I followed John Solomon for a number of years and found him to be a helpful and reliable source of information. Finally, Ground News. Now, Ground News is not a traditional news outlet, doesn't break stories or write stories or anything like that, but it's more of a tool. It's an aggregator of news stories that allows you to see where various news stories are across the political spectrum. And it shows you their bias rating for each source. So what's interesting about it is that you get to figure out like how the story has been framed from this particular news source. And then Ground News will also give you your blind spot of what your algorithm isn't showing you. It's kind of an interesting news source. So over the years, these are the kinds of tools that I have found helpful. These are the independent voices that have helped guide me and ground me from falling into one single narrative, help me not fall in the quicksand, but still reporting on things that are like, hey, like I would really like it if somebody would look into this and I have questions. And these are the kinds of people that I have found helpful over the years. And what is particularly helpful is that these people tend to report based on primary sources. They aren't afraid to follow the evidence, even when it disagrees with their personal worldview. Now, again, no human source is your ultimate authority. Your final filter must always be the Word of God, the leading of the Holy Spirit, And remembering Proverbs 18:17 is always good. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes along and examines him. We need to be the people who examine, okay? And that's why we as Christians need to ask questions like, what is the evidence and what's being left out? And how does this align with a biblical worldview? All right. In part 2, here's what we accomplished. We walked through the fog of facts together. We saw how facts can feel slippery at times, especially in this post-truth, post-trust world. We've looked at some of the problems of over-relying on fact checkers, how the goalposts of quote-unquote reliable information can keep moving, as well as some of the real psychological and relational pain that can happen within families and friendships and churches. And hopefully we've suggested some better alternatives to help keep you grounded and find your way through that fog. But I get it. The exhaustion is real, the division is painful, and the temptation to either check out completely or chase every narrative is strong. And so hopefully I'm helping you find a way of walking through the fog and not sinking in the quicksand. And here's the good news that we can never forget about as Christians. We are not left without hope or without help. While the world is getting blackpilled into nihilism, we should be the ones who are reminding them and bringing the good news of Jesus. That Jesus is still the truth with a capital T. The Holy Spirit is our counselor with a capital C, who guides us into all truth. And again, I want to propose that this fog of confusion is actually an invitation to grow up in our faith, become more like a Berean, and become more humble, more discerning, more dependent on the Lord than any institution or expert. God willing, next week, possibly in 2 weeks, depending on how long it takes me to write the third part, we're going to get into some very practical things of a biblical strategy for evaluating conspiracy theories or alternative claims. What are some tools that come from Scripture to help us test truth claims, hold fast to that which is good without falling into fear? If you found today's teaching helpful, would you do a few things for me? Would you drop a comment, especially if you're watching the replay? What fog, for lack of a better term, have you struggled with? Have these shifting narratives impacted your relationships? Have you yourself ever sunk into the quicksand of bad information and had to climb your way back out? I'd love to hear from you. Also, please make sure that you hit that like button, hit the thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel. A high percentage of people who watch my content are not subscribed. So please subscribe. It's totally free. It doesn't cost you anything. But that way you'll get a notification when I drop part 3. And once again, if this series has been a blessing to you, please consider partnering with us at centerforbiblicalunity.com/grow-the-family so that we can continue to produce content like this. In a noisy and confusing world, friends, I want to encourage you today to take time to ask the Lord to anchor you in His unchanging truth. That's my prayer for you today, my prayer for myself in this challenging and confusing age. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Krista Bontrager. Let's keep seeking truth together, anchored firmly in Christ. I'll see you next time for part 3. Grace and peace.